Welcome to Black Army Radio, episode 12, I believe We're sitting here, and it is freaking Wednesday, and we have maybe a few things to talk about. Also, we have our very first guest ever on the podcast. We have Dr. Sean Eudaily from the University of Montana Western. He is, I'm going to say political science, even though I know you want me to say political philosopher. I'll let you explain that later. Political science and constitutional studies at the University of Montana Western in Dillon, Montana. Fantastic little school. I went to that school. Sean and I have a relationship that goes back. I mean, shit, we're probably about 20 years now that we've known each other, a pretty long time. And so we're going to get into some constitutional issues and legality issues, and not just for states' rights, but federal rights and everything going on with the war and everything else. And we're going to talk about this plan that just came out, or this ceasefire that is kind of no longer holding up, that held up for about 13 seconds. And we're going to get into that. But how we doing today, Joel? What's happening, man?
Oh, another day. Not much new today. I think I'm glad nuclear bombs weren't dropped last night, but it's also with Trump when he just opens his mouth, and I think half the time he's just looking for a reaction. He's a little diva, and he wants that reaction from people as well, just so he could test the populace of how they're going to react if he does do something. So I'm not surprised he didn't drop nukes on him, and I'm also not surprised that he backed down to a ceasefire that had no teeth as well. So more just par for the course, it seems like.
Yeah, we'll get into the ceasefire stuff. And I mean, we're in a pretty interesting, weird spot right now. And it seems to be just as dangerous now as it has been. And we're gonna go into this ceasefire deal. Actually, before we even do that, like, Sean's sitting here. Why don't you say something, Sean? Say hi to the people, to the Black Army Radio badass mofos out there, universe, and give us a little howdy.
Howdy, everybody. Glad to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Ty and Joel, and looking forward to talking about what's going on and just shaking my head at it, trying to figure out what's going on in the news, just like everybody else at this point. I've told people I was an expert in the politics we used to have, but that's all history now. So, like, I don't feel like I'm any more expert about the politics that are going on today than anyone is. I just look at the news in the morning and shake my head and try to figure it out just like everybody else at this point.
That's a pretty good point, man. I almost feel like studying political science, like American political science, is almost like studying history at this point, because I feel like we're so far removed from like a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about today that you might as well just be studying history or political history, because it's like, are we actually really examining the system of governance that that we think that we're involved in here? And it doesn't seem that way. And so before we even get into that stuff, we had this US-Iran ceasefire deal that came out like right after our last podcast. And it didn't take long, man, before this ceasefire was immediately violated by Israel and Lebanon. And they smoked like 300 plus ongoing people in South Lebanon. Hezbollah, who is the Lebanese kind of, what Lebanon would consider their freedom fighters, what pretty much the rest of the world considers to be terrorists or Iranian proxies. They did drop arms. Like, they have not retaliated at all. And I think it's important for people to understand that that Hezbollah has adhered to the ceasefire, and Israel has not adhered to it in any way, shape, or form. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens tonight in Israel on whether or not Iran's going to be sending in a bunch of hypersonics, and Hezbollah is going to be attacking from the north and the Houthis from the south. It's going to be pretty interesting to see what happens, because this thing was violated right away. And I'm looking at this plan here, this ceasefire plan, and I'm going to get into this for about 5 minutes plus. The gaps are enormous here. Like, I don't understand like something seems to be really, really off with this deal. So first of all, Iran wants their portion. They have 10 points. They have 10 very, very distinct points that they want to have honored. And they want these points and this agreement to be codified into international law via the UN Security Council in a resolution. Like they don't want they've been there, done that kind of shit, right? They've had negotiators show up. Their negotiators have been killed repeatedly. They have more negotiators show up. They get killed. Right now, apparently, from what we're hearing, the Israel's actually kind of hunting these negotiators. Right now, they're negotiating in Pakistan. This is pissing Pakistan off because Pakistan's kind of acting as a liaison here between the United States and Iran on trying to get some kind of peace agreement here. And you have basically Iran, Pakistan, and the United States trying to keep people alive while Israel's trying to kill everybody. And so I'm going to go into Iran's end of this ceasefire before I go into the United States' end of this ceasefire. And then it'll become very glaring to everybody how far off we are here. I'm not really sure how long this is going to last, if it's even still lasting at all. Number one, formal U.S. non-aggression commitment, a permanent binding guarantee that the U.S. will never strike Iran again. At all, under any circumstances. Two, Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz. This is a big one. They're literally saying they must control the Strait of Hormuz. We've already heard Trump and Hegseth and all these other people talk about how that's not going to happen. Three, formal acceptance of Iran's right to enrich uranium. Formal acceptance of Iran's right to enrich uranium. Four, lifting of all primary sanctions. Okay, and five, secondary sanctions. Primary sanctions is basically talking about Iran itself, the sanctions that the United States has on Iran directly. Secondary sanctions are talking about foreign entities, companies that want to do business with Iran. They're getting sanctioned too. They want it both lifted. Six, termination of all UN Security Council resolutions against Iran. Termination of all Security Council resolutions against Iran. Number seven, termination of all IAEA Board of Governors resolutions against Iran. Now, this is more of the nuclear thing. Iran wants international nuclear oversight by the UAEA effectively ended as it relates to Iran. Okay. 8, full U.S. payment of war reparations. They're asking for like $2 billion in war reparations. Do either of you remember, because Obama caught a lot of shit for this, when he dropped over like a pallet of cash out of a C-17 in Iran, what was it, like 10 years ago? It was like $500 million, $500 billion. I don't remember
500
exactly,
million
but
sounds right.
At the start of
Okay.
the 6-country deal. Yeah.
Yeah.
We should remember that was
like that.
Iran's money.
Yeah.
It was the money we froze in 1979 during the Iranian Revolution, and we'd been keeping it on so it was it wasn't U.S. taxpayer dollars. It was money that had been seized by Iran all this time. Yeah, that they'd been suing in courts trying to get it back for decades. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now we didn't have to give it back, so it was definitely a negotiating check. But yeah.
Right. That's kind of like, I equate that a little bit to like the truckers in Canada during COVID that had their bank accounts frozen, and it's like, here's your money back. I mean, it's the same kind of thing, but $2 billion, and the conservative right really didn't like that shit with Obama at all. So I don't see Trump giving $2 billion in war.
But here's the numbers on that, Ty. It was $4 million in principal, and then the total ended up being 1.3 billion after interest payments negotiated and settled in the case at the Iran versus USA in claims in tribal tribunal in Hague. That's a tribunal they had to, so there was a bunch of interest in that as well. So, but it was settled in tribal court that we had to pay it back, or tribunal court that we had to pay it back as well. So.
Yeah, so it wasn't even necessarily an Obama decision, right? It was just one of those things that had to be done. And it's still going to be less money than we're going to have to give them for reparations for this shit, for sure. It's still going to be less because they're acting for $2 billion in reparations. 9, full withdrawal of U.S. combat forces in the entire Middle East. Now, our bases have been completely destroyed already. This might actually be easy We just don't need to spend billions and billions of dollars rebuilding our bases, and we can bring our boys and girls back here, or like, I guess, somewhere else, to one of our other 200 other international bases they can go to. 10, ceasefire extended to all active fronts, including Lebanon, which was violated immediately by Israel. Immediately. So, dude, that's right there. We can pick out a whole bunch of things. Okay, so here's the U.S. plan. Now, this is a 15-point plan, but they haven't released all the points. They've only released 9, which tells me they only have 9. They say they have 15. The other like 6 points are either classified or they're not going to release them, whatever. Okay, number 1, U.S. plan. 30-day ceasefire. An initial 30-day ceasefire is the foundation for negotiations. Okay, we're doing that right now. It's actually a 2-week ceasefire. 2, immediate reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. It was open and closed about 13 seconds later. 3, Iran commits to never developing nuclear weapons. Now, Iran and their points, they have multiple points saying, go fuck yourself on that one. They're not interested at all. Number 4, dismantling of nuclear facilities. Okay. Number 5, limits on Iran's ballistic missile program. This one is actually probably worth reading. Iran must accept caps or restrictions on its ballistic missile arsenal, which is okay. What they're probably talking about is intercontinental ballistic missiles, but also Israel just said ballistic missiles, right? And we pretty much just do what Israel tells us to do. And so, like, one of the reasons we started bombing them again this time around was because of ballistic missiles. Just ballistic missiles, not intercontinental ballistic missiles, just ballistic missiles. Okay. 6, end to Iran's regional proxy network. Now, the proxies, we're talking about funding Hezbollah, funding Hamas, funding the Houthis in Yemen. Like, that's what the proxy network is. 7, removal of U.S. sanctions on Iran. They're basically saying that they'll remove the sanctions, that they're willing to do that. 8, U.S. support for Iran's Bushehr nuclear power plant. Basically, the United States is saying they're willing to help provide technical and economic support for their power plant, for their nuclear power plants. That's part of it. And 9, well, there is no actual point 9. It says points 9 through 15 are not publicly disclosed. So if you look at this right off the top of the bat, here's where the problems have: nuclear enrichment, Strait of Hormuz, U.S. military presence, sanctions, war reparations, proxies, which is Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, nuclear weapons, and the UN Security Council turning this into international law. And a couple things. So originally, the United States did not said that Lebanon was part of the ceasefire originally. But after Israel started bombing Lebanon right away, the United States is now saying that Lebanon is not part of the ceasefire deal. What do you guys think about that shit?
I heard Iran was already starting an initiative to bomb for retaliation for Lebanon. And also, like, some of the backstory between these negotiations is they have Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner have been the 2 leading negotiators who's been trying to work with, like, our side in Iran. And Jared Kushner has a lot of money tied into Israel, and Witkoff has been caught in a lot of lies, and also some of the Iranian officials think in the first negotiations that they were trying to soften up certain regions. So they felt like he was kind of playing them to soften up certain regions for attacks. And that's part of the reason that right now Iran is saying that they only want to negotiate if J.D. Vance is our negotiator. So that's another interesting layer to all this, is the people that we've been sending to negotiate with him. Iran doesn't want to negotiate with our side as well.
Yeah. And Trump said today, I think, that he's not sending J.D. Vance to Pakistan.
Right.
And another interesting twist of events, because that's who they want to talk to, right? Because they're like, we don't want to talk to Trump. They don't want to talk to Trump, man. They want to talk to somebody else. And so, anyway, there's that. I don't know. I think the next 24 to 48 hours is going to be wildly telling about how this is going to this is going to be a huge test with our relationship with Israel. This is going to be a huge test of our relationship with them, I think.
Did either of you see an official statement from the Israeli government on the ceasefire? Because I didn't. Like, I saw the U.S. statement, I saw the Iranian statement, but I wasn't even clear whether early on in the day before what went down in Lebanon, whether Israel had even said we're part of the ceasefire. Because obviously, if it's just a ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran in the middle of a war with the other parties, then that's a weird kind of ceasefire.
Right. That is a good point. I know Netanyahu said, and this wasn't an official statement. I think he was basically just quoted, of saying that Lebanon will not be part of the ceasefire. Like, a ceasefire in Lebanon is not part of the umbrella macro level ceasefire. They're he seemed to make that clear pretty damn quick, it seems like. But it wasn't like an official statement. I think he was just quoted in saying that, and he definitely lived up to that quick. And they hit Lebanon harder than they've hit Lebanon at any other time in the last month, which is kind of telling too. It was kind of like a big FU to the international community. You know what I mean? Like, this is what we think about what you guys are trying to figure out. And so, yeah, I don't know. Let's get into the good stuff. Professor Dr. Sean Eudaily. Like I said, political philosopher and constitutional study extraordinaire, University of Montana, Western, Dillon, Montana. We are going to find out, before we get into the meat and potatoes of geopolitics, international relations, constitutional studies, federalism, any of this other stuff that we may or may not talk about a little bit, that is kind of going to marry up to what we're doing globally right now. We need to find out who exactly Sean Eudaily is. That's what we want to do. So, first of all, before I even start answering these questions that I got written down here, Sean, it became really apparent real quick that you don't like to be called a political science professor. And so I can appreciate that. I can, and I can explain that more later. But could you explain, just kind of however you wish, on that aspect, on what you do?
Sure. It's, like, as I told you before, it's just a weird pet peeve that I have. Because certainly I came up in school, as studying political science and, other social sciences and things. And it's just, as time has gone on, I have, fallen out of love with that side of the intellectual tradition. And I mean, it goes back all the way to college, when I, because I was also a history major and always was a law guy. And as time went on, I just was finding the mainstream practice of social, political science in particular, lacking. And so, as a student, I went searching for useful tools in other places. So in graduate school, I dabbled, studied a little geography, studied a little more history, obviously, but also economics and sociology. But eventually I just, kind of found that my home base, both as a scholar and increasingly as a teacher over these last 3 decades since, that it's the traditional approach to the study of politics, the grounded in political philosophy, in law, in history, in constitutional history, which to me, speaks more than any of the attempts to turn it into a science. I mean, I really kind of have developed a position that I think that a lot of the social sciences, as far as how they developed in universities in the last 150 years, was really just a kind of status obsession, because natural sciences had come into the university from outside after the scientific revolution and had pride of place and were getting all the money and the attention. And so I think you saw a lot of people who were like, oh, we want to be scientists too, so that we can get funding and attention and all that. And I don't know. I just look back and go, I don't think we've learned anything from the attempt to study politics scientifically since the 19th century that we didn't already know from studying politics from a humanistic point of view. long before that. And so I guess as I got older, I just got more and more comfortable with that being my position, that I don't think it does any particular harm to try to study things from a social scientific or a quantified perspective, but it really just didn't speak to my soul at all in politics. And I have one story I always tell, that kind of crystallized that for me. I was actually not on my own campus, but visiting a friend of mine who I'd gone to a master's program with, who went on to a PhD at a different campus than I did. I went to Maryland for my PhD. But anyway, we were in the grad lab up at Penn State where he went. And it's an entire room full of people getting PhDs in political science, mostly in American politics. And somebody pops up from their machine and goes, "Does anybody know who the Speaker of the House is?" And nobody did. I mean, I did, but I didn't say anything because I was just a guest. I was like, I don't think you're really that into politics. If you're studying American politics as a professional, it was Denny Hastert at the time. Boy, the things we know about Denny Hastert now. It fits right into the peccadillos of the ruling class. But anyway, just that was it clear to me that, they're interested in doing statistics and publishing papers and being treated as a scientist. I'm interested in politics. And those two things didn't meet in too many graduate seminar rooms for me. So I guess I made my trips through the social sciences, and of course, my penance for that is that I'm called to teach them all the time. Just got finished teaching up a sociology class because in these days, our university decided it's not worth our money to keep a sociology professor, but we had 25 sociology majors who will need classes and a way to graduate. So guess who was the only person on the faculty left with sociology training? So I get to play sociology professor now, in the same way that starting next year, I teach a third of my load in geography because we don't have any other geography professor to teach, and it's a required subject for elementary education, which, as Ty knows, is a big program here because we started as a teacher's college, and even though we do other things now, we're still very much in the teacher prep game. And so it's kind of strange. My career has taken all sorts of weird turns. So next year I'm teaching 2 geography classes, 2 sociology classes, a philosophy class, and a literature class. Not a single politics class on the schedule, which is just part and parcel of the fact we're really short-staffed, but also that, politics has become something that at least students that I see not terribly interested in these days. And when you start talking to them about why they don't think they're interested in politics, it's easy to see how they got to that position. Breaks my heart a little bit because I think there's a lot of things about politics that are very important. And as I've always tried to tell students, whether you're interested in politics or not, politics are interested in you. You probably noticed that the first time you got a paycheck and went, "Where did my money go?" "Oh, to the government." That's called taxes. That's the way in which politics is interested in you and doesn't care if you're interested back. So I've always just thought that there was enough functional reasons that we all have to care about politics. But I certainly understand why students today are driven into a bitter taste in their mouth about the way politics has gone. And for them, it's their entire life. Like, they don't remember the before times. I'm haunted by being old. And like I said, I suppose at one point I was an expert in how American politics worked until it stopped working that way. And now I'm as confused as everybody else. But for the students I see now, this is all they know of politics. They were in middle school when Trump was elected the first time. And so, trying to explain to them how things worked in the 80s and 90s and 70s is just like talking to them about the Renaissance or the Roman Republic, right? It's just all history you learn out of a book to them. And being someone who grew up in those ages and, learned politics in a practical sense and in a world that doesn't exist anymore, then I can kind of relate and why they're turned off by it. To call myself a political philosopher just because that's my home base as far as my approach to politics. And but certainly it's,
I,
like I said, it's just one of those inside baseball things for academics. How we care about titles and stuff.
that's right. I remember a joke you made once in class, and I've used it ever since for various occasions. And I think you said something like, "It takes 20 to 25 pages for you to clear your throat." And so it's like,
Yep,
yeah, that sounds about right. That
that's
sounds
about
about
right.
right. But the science aspect is interesting because, like, it's measurable, right? Like, you have the scientific method, you have measurable outcomes. It's like
Yeah.
there's a disparity there a little bit
And
when
my
you're
argument
talking
is
about,
is
like,
that's just
mhm,
resulted in people reducing what they study to what they can easily measure, rather than studying
yep,
the important stuff and try to figure out, oh, this is important even though it's hard to measure. Everybody just takes the path of least, hard to measure does not result in you publishing many papers.
Well,
So
and
everybody just takes surveys and the stuff that's readily available and does very banal things on them as far as I'm concerned. And again, it was different back when politics was very routinized and things, and if you wanted to study it that way, it didn't excite me intellectually, but I didn't think there was anything wrong with it. In the politics that we have now, which is so existential and about our basic values of what we want out of life and what we want out of our government and things, to me those are always been the main subjects that political philosophy has focused on, right? What do we mean by good government? What do we mean by justice, right? What do we do with a tyrant in office? These are the fundamental questions that have been animating political philosophy for 2000 plus years. And when I look around, I'm like, yep, them the questions we have to answer today. So, again, it always surprises people, even if they know I'm a philosophy professor, that it's not just my job. I actually take this stuff seriously. We spent much of the last year on the strategic planning committee, which is kind of interesting because it involves faculty and staff and students and community members. And one of the community members, CEO of the hospital here, was like, "You guys keep bringing up Aristotle. It's like you really take this stuff serious." I'm like, "Yeah, we kind of do." Um, and I suppose that makes university life pretty different than real life, but
God, why are you
it
guys
is
still
what
talking
it
about
is.
John Locke? That's Adam Smith. That's weird.
Old, the students think it's all like all this stuff is so old. I'm like, well, yeah.
Yeah, it's really not
I
that
I
old.
have a I have a
It's really not that old. That's
No,
the
I mean,
funny
you have
thing.
the perspective in America at 250 years old is a relatively young country. But that's not the perspective
We're within the
students
margin of
bring to
error.
bear, right? They're 20. 20 seems like a long time. So 250 seems unthinkable to them. And when I'm throwing thousands of years at them, then they just shake their head and go, "Oh, are you that old?" You
Duh.
know, yeah, no. I made the mistake of asking a group of freshmen how old they thought I was a couple of years ago, and I'm old, but I'm not that old. But they can't distinguish me from Noah. So it's just okay. It's just like I'm old, you're young. That's all the more detailed we have to get here.
well, and real quick when it comes to talking about like science and measuring stuff and being able to have data to prove a point. Like I think one thing what gets lost in our modern politics is like who's proving that point? Like how are they gathering this study? There's a few like what I would call actual people who do a real or actual organizations that do a non-biased studies, but most of them you really have to look at it and then look at the outlier and then look at the computer study to really look through it because a lot of them are just um, guiding stats to what they want to say, and that's the hardest part about it is like even if there is data behind it, the other side just comes up with their own study that says this is wrong, and then you have the two parties just looking on the other side of the fence from each other, arguing the same thing just from a different perspective because they have numbers behind it now.
Yeah.
So,
We should remember, Mark Twain's old adage that we have lies, damn lies, and then there's statistics.
yep.
As three ways.
Yeah,
But again, statistics can be useful, but only when people
yeah.
understand statistics. And
I hate
obviously, again,
statistics
when
so
we look at
much.
the numeracy of the American people, I don't think talking in terms of math is really going to improve our conversation much.
Nope.
Um, so it's and
Right.
that's certainly true of a lot of even college students these days. Um, but yeah, I think it's, and again, going back to, traditional subjects of philosophy help us get around those questions, because rhetoric, right, is followed right behind logic. Philosophers love logic, and they love making reasoned arguments and evidence and all those things. But philosophers also tell us normal people don't, right? The normal people are much more swayed by either the authority of, right, what we call the ethos of the speaker or the author, right? I trust this person, so I'll take whatever they say, or that they're driven by emotional things, right? By pathos, as we put it in rhetoric, and that logos or logic is actually, when you're trying to convince other people, it's really useful to convince other philosophers, maybe other academics, but in fact that, the people have always been, swayed more by ethical appeals uh, and emotional appeals, and that if you're going to have politics where you have to convince people in order to do something, whether that's a small group of people when you're negotiating a ceasefire or something, or a large group of people when you're trying to, govern a country by consent of the governed, then you're in a rhetorical situation where talking to other people and convincing them to your side, that's a really important skill. But that's very different than the kind of conversation that scientists have with scientists. And I think we can see that in all the areas. I mean, certainly there's all sorts of areas of politics where scientific knowledge could help us quite a bit. Those tend to be the places we have the hardest time as a society, right? Whether you think about the fights over climate change, or, all the fights we had over,
Yeah, that's a
healthcare
good point.
and vaccines and things during the pandemic, or what, because the fact is the vast majority of people aren't scientists. And so the scientific arguments that may sway every scientist in a room don't necessarily move the crowd. And in politics, it's the people writ large, and then groups of people are the ones that you have to get to agree to things. And so, I mean, I think I see a lot of frustrated scientists on my campus and every other campus that are like, but the graph shows this. I'm like, yeah, that's not how people work, though. That's how scientists have come to work. Right. And they're used to talking to each other. And it's why I think scientists do great work in science. But the big struggle they have is communicating with non-scientists. And we've just kind of hit a
Right.
point where most average people don't understand science. We don't do a great job teaching it in the school. And because of that, then people, like you said, because there are reasons that you can always doubt statistics, and there's always a counter argument and other evidence and things. And if people know just enough of that to be a little skeptical, then they just fill it in with the things that they want to believe anyway. And you get, motivated reasoning. And that's, again, it's typical. It's not a crime. That's the way human beings tend to be. The more we care about something, the more we think about it in a certain way, so that actually being completely, objective in things, as much as it's a goal, sometimes it's not the usual practice of how human beings operate. And understanding that,
Yeah.
and understanding that human beings are emotional creatures and are embodied creatures, and that politics needs to speak to all of those things too. I mean, that's, again, I think about the lessons Machiavelli teaches us, about how do you motivate people? Well, you can do it through love. You can do it through fear. Both of those are emotional appeals, right? Neither of those a scientific appeal to, rational truth. But truth be told, right, this idea that we can govern ourselves through reason, as I heard Ty talking on maybe your last episode there, is really what makes the American experiment unique. But we may, in fact, be proving that there are some limits to that. And there's a reason why traditional societies relied on other means of sociability and to get people to come to an agreement, because um, just having a wide open where everybody can have their own opinion is certainly something that appeals to me, especially from a First Amendment perspective. Um, but, through much of American history, we either relied on the fact that we had a lot of shared things that we didn't have to fight about, which allowed us to fight about the other things in a more constrained way. And quite honestly, that throughout American history, we always, had kind of built-in scapegoats in the country that we didn't allow to be part of the conversation. That was
Yep.
also part of how we bought off, to limit debate and limit conflict. And it's precisely when that process breaks down, then we can't solve politics, through reason and speech, and then the guns come out, just as they did in the 1860s and in other points of time in our history on smaller scale, obviously in the Civil War. But that's certainly the worry today, is that we've come to the position again where we're in a position where rational agreement doesn't seem to be making much headway against people's dug in perspectives and differences in identity and those other things. And I just, again, I believe that because those are simply the problems of governing human beings, then the humanist study that we've been studying how human beings work for thousands of years through history and philosophy and religion and culture are our best guide to trying to figure out how we make that work today, as much as we face problems today that obviously people in earlier generations, the founders couldn't have imagined the technological, situation we have today and the problems that come from it. But it doesn't mean they didn't understand how people work. And I think that's the thing that, doesn't go out of fashion, that people have been studying how human beings behave with other human beings for thousands and thousands of years, and society has changed, but we as a species haven't. It's like the old joke about the fact that we have, prehistoric, biology, and medieval institutions and godlike technology. What could possibly go wrong with that combination?
That's so good.
We're
That's really good.
We're hairless apes. We're hairless apes with intercontinental ballistic missiles and thermonuclear weapons and drones and yet, you go back to the motives of anger and rage and all those things. I got a chance to teach a class on the classical epic with one of our English professors this year, and so we taught the Iliad and the Odyssey and Virgil's Aeneid. And getting to go back and and again, those are texts from 3,500 years ago in the case of Plato. And of course, we're oral tradition for probably 1,000 years before they were ever written down. It was amazing to watch students, from the 21st century who had never had a chance to be introduced to any of that old stuff before, really were taken by just how human and like how real their sense of people's emotion and how people's behavior works and how conflict works and what it takes to bury the hatchet and come to a deal with someone you really detest, and all those things that are at the heart of politics then as well as now. I enjoy that part of the job, right? Convincing students, this day that, this 3,000-year-old, book here is probably worth your time to read is kind of a fun thing to get to do for a living. Beats the hell out of most jobs.
That's when I start talking about like real history. That's when when you're talking about real historical concepts and ideals and stuff, you're talking that kind of time frame. For me personally, I like that a lot. A lot of what you said too reminds me a lot of Plato's Allegory of the Cave, and I remember us studying that like as an undergrad a long, long, long time ago. And it seems a lot to me like modern American politics. I'm feeling that way a lot, where you have the younger generation, they're kind of just good with the shadows that are on the wall. You know what I mean? It's like there's so much bullshit out there, and it's like it's almost kind of scary, right? Like you're almost afraid to get out of college. Like, where are you going to work? You're going to have to start paying your student loans. Like all of a sudden, reality is going to bitch slap you in the face, and it's going to hurt. You're not really sure where you're going to go. Like, are you going to be able to live where you grew up around your family, or you're going to have to pop smoke and go someplace completely different, like Kentucky or like Alabama, where shit's still kind of affordable a little bit. We're in such a weird crossroads as a society between our debt and our lack of education. We're very, very educated, but I don't feel like we're real smart. You know what I mean? I see that. I feel like I see that a lot with people these days, and we could we could really use in a society that's built around reason, like we talked about. You kind of have to not have an educated or smart populace that's read up in the issues and the history. And we get manipulated a lot too when we talk about conspiracy theory and everything else on this program, and how those guys are batting like 900 right now. And it's like that's a problem, because if you're not getting fed the correct information, you're getting shown the wrong shadows. And then you're voting on shadows that you think are real, but they're not real, because they're being shown to you and presented in a completely different way than what reality really is, you know? and it's dangerous for us as a civilization. We're kind of seeing that now, how we are with like not just warfare, but like we're more concerned. I'm more concerned of American streets. You know what I mean? American blood against American blood. My kids running plate carriers and guns against somebody else's kids running plate carriers and guns. And the fact that we're being shown the wrong shadows with purpose on you know, like in on purpose intentionally to a populace that is already having a problem with reality and truth as it is is a huge issue. Yeah, go ahead, Joel.
I mean, there's a couple things that I'd like to hit on. I think one, we have a 24-hour news cycle, so like our brains don't get a break from this information. Like it's just constant. So you wake up and you're gonna pick the side that you're on and get fed that. Then I also think, especially in the last like 15 years, like history's been weaponized, science has been weaponized as far as like political like ideologies, you know, like so if you and not to say like a lot of weird shit didn't happen during COVID, but there was a very small fraction of people who were like anti-vaxxers, right? COVID came on, that was politicized, and then there's this huge movement towards that, you know, and then reading in between the lines of you know, capitalism, vaccinations, the money being made if they're ethical when they're not ethical, you know, and then all of a sudden that's weaponized. And like you said, depending on which side you're on, you're going to be fed this thing. So then when a science is taught in school, there's going to be a kid who has a totally different ideology than the kid sitting next to him. And he's not going to want to take that from the same perspective, you know, and we allow things like science and history, you know, there is a big pushback on how we should teach history and what we should be teaching, you know, from the left and the right, you know, and I think as soon as those things are weaponized, like it's really hard to come back from. History is history. You know, if something happened, you should be teaching, and that's how we learn. That's how we move on. And when somebody wants to slant it from a different perspective, whether it's left or right, like we're losing what our education should be based on because of these political ideologies. Because now all of a sudden if you teach something about black history at a certain school, somebody's going to be upset about it because it's black history, you know, and like or vice versa, you know. And I think once you have those things weaponized, like it's really hard to come back from especially when the core RNC or DNC are actively weaponizing those things. It just divides us instead of finding, and I don't know how you find a happy medium. I don't know how you go about it, but I think that's a big problem in our
Independent media,
society is
homie.
all those things have become,
Like that's
yeah.
this is it right here. I don't know how else you do it. Like what we're talking about too, when we're talking about media, is our media is manipulated. Like we have the First Amendment, and it's supposed to be a freedom of, you know, the freedom of the press, which is paramount in a free society. We talk about this. I think the freedom of the press is wildly ridiculously important. It must be. It has to be, because the public has to be educated on what they're thinking and voting on. You know what I'm saying? That's what we're. If you're manipulating how they feel, it's like we found out that a lot of these old anchors, like the Brokaws, and like all those, they had CIA ties on purpose. You know what I mean? Because the information was coming in intended to be manipulated. And so, hey, I want to ask you a question here, Sean, and we got a few
Okay.
here, and I want to just go with some good ones here. So a lot of people in our audience were former Trumpies, like I was. I voted for the dude 3 times, did that, America First, all that other bullshit. I did it to end forever wars, like no regime change, the economy. Like I had very distinct things like that I was gearing towards on why I did that. And then on February 28th, he launches this joint war with Israel against Iran. Can you walk us through constitutionally the legality of this war with Iran and Congress's authorization and stuff? Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it's really simple. It's illegal. The Constitution is very, very clear that it's Congress that gets to decide when the American people goes to war. The reason why the framers gave that power to Congress was that they were specifically taking it away from the executive branch. And again, remember, as Ty well knows and his studies and things, right, that the even though the framers of our Constitution, in some ways, we should also remember, didn't represent, the majority opinion of America in the 1870s. It's kind of one of the true miracles is how the Federalists, who were clearly no more than 35% of the population, and a lot less in a lot of states, how they managed to win the ratification fight, because the vast majority of the American people probably didn't want the Constitution as written. So there's that tension, and of course that always bugs me as a historian, how little people understand, as I constantly am chiding Stutz, right? The anti-federalists are our founders too. And that understanding that
Yep.
what we were taught as what the founders gave us, right? The Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Well, no, the Federalists didn't think we needed a Bill of Rights. And the anti-federalists didn't want the Constitution. What we got was a compromise of those two things, so that even though the Constitution in many ways was a step back from the principles of the Revolution, it is in some ways our Thermidor moment, our counter-revolution, because we in fact did reduce a lot of the more actively democratic things that were going on in the states in those first years of the country's history after the Revolution. But in the Constitution, we get a principled reason for how we're going to be together and how we're going to stay together and how we're going to grow together as a country. And so I always still think that it has to be the beginnings of where we talk about all this stuff. And again, from a constitutional standpoint, it's really straightforward in that Congress has the war making power, and that the whole purpose of dividing that and the commander-in-chief power was to make sure that the same person running the war was not the person who decided to go to war, because that's exactly the situation you have in a monarchy. Of course, coming out of the
Right.
British monarchy, we didn't want to be in
Or a
that
dictatorship.
situation. Yeah. On the other hand, it's also fair to say we should remember that the last official war that Congress declared was the Second World War.
Yep.
And that's Ty knows. I mean, Ty's fought in the baker's dozen of wars in his time alone, and that we
Yep.
fought, depending on how you count them, right, 50 some wars, kinetic activity, excursion. That was the new one Trump tried this time. We're not at war with Iran. We're just like friendly bombing them. It's just an excursion, like a vacation, except with bombs. Now, I mean, to me, these are
like
all
going to
wars,
Disneyland
and
to the
that
bar and just
therefore,
start punching people in the mouth and being like, "I'm on vacation. What are you
yeah,
guys pissed off about?"
and that means that every American president from Harry Truman on, is in some greater or lesser sense a war criminal, because we certainly have fought wars, and many wars of our choosing on our timeline in ways that don't purport with our constitutional system. Now, of course, we could throw in the War Powers Act, and that was Congress's somewhat weak attempt in the 70s to put the genie back in the bottle. But they, from my perspective as a constitutionalist, the War Powers Act itself gives up too much, because it says that, well, the president can basically start wars, and then if they go for more than a month, they got to come back to Congress. Well, to me, that violates the whole framers' design, which is that the separation of those powers is meant to put the brakes on before we get involved in a conflict, not after. Because, frankly, Congress as an institution has failed the American people wholesale, because it is their job more than anyone else to uphold that power and to restrain the power
It's
of the
like the War
presidency.
Resolutions Act, right? Like the War Resolutions Act. Like they literally voted themselves out of having a say in this, like on purpose. It felt like.
Yep. And despite that, every president from both parties has, taken the position that the War Powers Act is unconstitutional and that they'll just ignore it anyway. So, I mean, that's the War Powers, Act is a good indication of how this system is broken down, not how it's supposed to work. But again, as much as I'm a critic of President Trump, this is not just a Trump problem. I mean, this
No, not
was,
at all.
a Biden problem and an Obama problem and a Clinton problem and a Reagan problem and a Bush problem. Like we have been in this
Yeah.
situation essentially since the end of the Second World War. And, quite frankly, it's because we ended that war and looked around and went, oh, we have an empire. Now, we already really had an empire, right? But we had an empire that we could lie to ourselves and say was different than the European empires. Because, in our early history, of course, we saw ourselves as an anti-imperialist power because of how we,
Yeah.
birthed in revolution, and that therefore, both in the Monroe Doctrine in the 19th century and certainly in the push for, you know, Wilson's 14 points and the attempts at the League of Nations and then the United Nations and things, all those are American policy ideas and pushes, which is, to find a new way to try to restrain these things. But, the fact that at the very, very time that we're trying to build international institutions to restrain violent conflict, that we gave up on our own domestic institutions that are designed and did quite a good job, frankly, in the 19th century, keeping us out of a lot of foreign entanglements and wars. Which certainly, when you look at the pace, I mean, and especially because when you look at the pace compared to other countries in the world, and again, it's notable that in the 19th century, who was at war the most of any country? Britain. Why?
Britain. Yeah.
Because they were the hegemon running the world, and running the world like involves you everywhere. And the United States found ourselves taking over that position for the British after the Second World War. And, and ever since, we just kind of embraced the national security state and the needs of that, military empire. I mean, Ty mentioned the fact that, there are 270 some countries in the world, and we have military bases in 215 or something of them. So again, our empire doesn't look exactly like other empires in that we don't have a lot of colonies where we send a lot of Americans, but certainly we have, an empire that is built primarily on military power and on being able to project that force around the world. And in setting that as the strategic goal of the country is in some ways just fundamentally at odds with the Republican Constitution, which is meant to keep us focused on, trying to make this a more perfect union and not gallivanting around the world trying to slay monsters. You know,
Oh, yeah.
President Washington warned us that it is farewell address, right? All those many, again, that's why I'm a big on the, if you don't know your history, you are definitely doomed to repeat it because you don't even know that you're making mistakes that people have already made before. At least knowing history allows you to make new mistakes. We're human beings. We're going to make mistakes, right? We're a fallible species, but I just think that, a lot of that background, we've just gotten to the point where the average American citizen doesn't know any of it. And again, that falls on people in my profession. I mean, as much as I hate the fact that that we couldn't have got here as a society if public education hadn't failed, but it
Right.
did fail, right? And as you said, as the media failed,
Yep.
for many years, the free press was often considered the fourth branch of American government and was, it's the only industry mentioned directly in the Constitution. Right. Like, so of all the things people do to make a living, right, the one that the founders like, yeah, these people that sell the news, they're kind of important in this whole deal. And again, we can we can go all the way back again to the ancient world, right? Plato proposed public education over 2,000 years ago. Just never happened.
Right.
But in Plato's laws, he has a fully worked out system of, well, if we're gonna trust citizens, we need to train him somehow, and if we're gonna train him to, provide good citizens for this particular regime, then they need to be trained in the principles of our law and our culture, and therefore the government has a role in that. Needs to pay teachers and train. Like, it's amazing how modern it sounds when you realize you're reading something that was written hundreds and hundreds of years before Christ walked the earth.
Didn't the Sumerians have public education? Didn't the Sumerians? Yeah, I mean, they had like the Anunnaki and everything that they talk about, but I know that they had astronomy, They had, man, they had wild amounts of education. Like looking into those guys, they took that stuff. They took education really, really, really seriously in ancient Sumer. And man, they had like, I know that they had university systems for like cuneiform, for astronomy, for regular day-to-day jobs. I want to say they had like linguists. They had they had a crazy education system, and that was, I mean, shit, that had to have been like what, 2000 BC, 1500 BC, because
Yep.
Abraham, you know, biblically would have come out of Sumer in like 1800 BC, something like that. But it's kind of cool because the further and further you go back, if you could really discover and like nail down these primary sources, you do find that education, like being read up and spun up on stuff, has always been a thing for the educated populace and for a free society. Like what Airfinger's quote, free society, depending on obviously where you live, what time frame you live, who you're living under, and all that kind of stuff. But
And
when I
we
read a
often
lot of this
forget that
stuff from,
this stuff
yeah, go ahead.
definitely didn't start in the West, right? Eastern
No, not at
civilization,
all.
as far as schooling
Yeah, not at all.
and all those things, was far ahead of the West, honestly, right until maybe the early modern period. And that a lot of the big movements, even some of the, there's a lot of discussion about, what extent the kind of influences on Greek philosophy came from outside Greece and came from the Eastern world and things. And certainly,
Mm-hmm.
we wouldn't have had, the big pushes towards the Renaissance. That was, an age in which a lot of knowledge was coming back from the Eastern world and Muslim civilization by that time. And, and people rarely know the story of how, the philosophy schools were kicked out of Greece and Italy and things by the church at a certain point in time. And so where did they go? They went to universities in Baghdad and places like that where they were still welcome. And so, there used to be a vastly different intellectual culture in what today we call the Middle East and
What
those
do they
kind
call
of
them? The
things. But
mystery
again, that's,
schools? Remember the mystery schools?
yeah,
The mystery schools is an
yeah,
interesting thing to read up on. There was one in Egypt, I think India. There's even speculation that Jesus, like, because there is one biblical text that talks about Jesus going to Egypt, and a lot of people kind of miss that. Now, whether or not, whatever, but there's a lot of really cool history in the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, that's certifiable and like you can look to. You don't have to be a believer. But there's like, I don't remember if it's Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. They talk about Jesus basically spending his entire youth in Egypt. And there was a mystery school there at that time, which is just kind of, this is like a sidetrack thing, but
yeah.
that's interesting to me because those mystery schools, like you're talking about, Sean, like people used to be sent, right, from all different societies and cultures and countries and languages to go to these various mystery schools to become educated on like everything from like plant work, psychedelics, astronomy, math, potions, language, all kinds of stuff. Those mystery schools were probably like the first true old universities.
Yep. In many ways. And again, it's the corrective where if the more you know of history, then, it just opens up to, all sorts of different ways of looking at the world. And quite simply, when you don't know the history, there just becomes a limit to what you can think and what you can know. I know it's, like I
Right.
said, I was teaching sociology this last month and boy, great students, some of the best students we have around, but they've been so well trained in psychology and sociology as behavioral scientists that when we hit other things that were like outside that tradition, the students were like, well, we're not so familiar with that. And of course, my go-to is always, well, what's going on historically at that time. And they're like, I don't know, we're not history majors. And so I realized very quickly, I'm like, oh, that's not going to work with this group of students. And then one of them's like, could you explain what the Cold War was all about? I was like, yes, I can. But again, that's just
There
not
you
the
go.
kind of thing that comes up for them.
Yeah.
And so, it's, and again, it's not like knowing about the Cold War is an important life skill in
Yep.
2026, but it does certainly, explain why, for instance, we were talking about why in the 1950s in America, Marxist approaches to sociology just weren't in fashion. And you're like, yeah, there's a good reason for that, right? What was going on in the 1950s? And so again, context. If nothing else, history helps provide the context for things that are different and things that are the same. And without that, it becomes very easy, like I said, looping back into people with different media diets and in media bubbles. If all you hear all day is your opinion being spit back at you, or we now have technologies where you can go, well, I only want to hear my opinion. So if you start saying something that I don't like, then I just change the channel and find somebody to tell me what I want to hear, which is, very much, the media environment where we're now in. It becomes very hard to then have conversations across any of these divides because honestly, people don't even know that it's a divide, right? Because if all you're getting is your media from one side or the other, then you're just getting so narrowcast that you literally don't know that your fellow citizens, and you hear this from people on both sides. Well, the people on the other side sound like crazy people, right? They're going all about these, they're all mad about stuff I don't even know about because it's not being portrayed in the media you're consuming. I always ask students, I'm like, where do you get your news? And the most disturbing answer is that most of them don't get news in the sense that I think of news. I had a freshman ask me,
TikTok.
what was a newspaper? Yeah,
Probably
I was going to say
TikTok.
that, like, they get it from their phone, but again, they're not going to news sources on their phone to get news. They're getting, news from social media, whether it's TikTok or Facebook or X or whatever platform they might be on. But again, I'm like, that's not news. That's just somebody talking. And as you say, there's a lot of independent media now, but it's very hard to find it for most students. And I think about, the kind of things that I do in my media diet that are just really unreasonable to expect students in the general population, like I'll take, find a story and then take hours to track down and make sure how is this being covered in other sources and look at 10 different, like, that's not normal for people. That's not how people just check the news. And so I, even though obviously all of it is out there, the internet, everything you could want and everything you would never want are both available all the time, but that it asks just so much of people in terms of time and energy that, people are just, working their ass off just to be poor and try to put a roof over their head of their kids and put food on the table.
Yeah.
Like they don't got time to think about the news for 4 hours a day like I might.
Working their ass off to be poor.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's it's one of those things that unfortunately I think is increasingly the case for an increasing number of the American people. Is I mean, if you've ever been in a poor community, it becomes real obvious real fast. The one thing that's not in short supply in a poor community is work. Like, poor people work all the time. It just doesn't matter anymore the way that it used to matter as far as social mobility or having to have a decent middle class. It's, we've worked ourselves into an economic situation that I think is as unsustainable as the political situation we're in. And of course, the two are deeply, deeply embedded in each other.
Well, and I think another big problem is like when you when you see when you see the other side, you're getting the worst example of the other side. So when an argument's brought up, and just because this is a flashy point, like transgender arguments brought up, they bring there's a drag queen show at an elementary school, and that did happen, but it's not happening everywhere, and I don't think it should happen, but they bring up that example, and then the left will bring, well, every righty thinks transgenders are child molesters, and like there's this, they show the worst side of a conversation that has so much nuance to it, and we're not going to, and with the advantageous of the internet, like once there's a pact of people behind something, you're never going to make it disappear. So we as a society have to find a way to like work within that, because once there's a cause or something like that, like it's not going to go away. Now it's here forever. So as a society, how do we go about that without making each other, pointing the extremes of each side and saying this is our baseline, when really most of the people are right about here, and those two sides everyone knows are extreme,
Yeah. And as you say, they're self-interested. They're weaponizing the knowledge for political ends. And, within the bounds, that's acceptable in our society, right? We have,
Right.
we have a contested political system. We're not supposed to, it's okay to disagree, right? It's okay to have different political candidates. We have competitive elections. That's, there's some element of that would be fine. But in times past, what kept that in balance was integrative factors in the wider culture and things that don't exist anymore. Both just because, the country as we've moved forward is just bigger and bigger and, even as optimistic as, Madison and the Federalists, who writing were about an extended republic. They weren't thinking of a continental republic with 350 million people. They couldn't even conceive of that. We got to remember where we started as a country and just the scale. And again, predicting the future is not a good business for anybody to be in. A lot of the, when you get into the nitty gritty of a lot of the compromises in the Constitution, particularly the ones over slavery, they were driven by expectations about what would happen demographically and in the economy that just turned out to be wrong. Right. And because of that, we ended up with things in the Constitution that I think, far extended the period of slavery and up to the Civil War in ways that at least some of the founders really thought, oh, this is, slavery is going to die out of its own accord, because they were from northern states where it had kind of died out of its own accord because it wasn't economically viable. But in other parts of the country, it was not only economically viable, it was the economy. And so, even the differences we had then between North and South and West were so stark as we got to
Then it
be a
became
bigger
like
and
a
bigger
10th Amendment
country.
issue, right? Basically.
Yeah. Yeah. And really, again, it's when you think about, I'm not sure that the Civil War ever happens if it weren't for the Louisiana Purchase. Because the Civil War was really not, it was fought between North and South over slavery. But they'd already worked out, compromises, they didn't love each other and it certainly caused a lot of conflict. But the reason it came to blows was the question of who's going to control the West. Well, if we didn't have a West, right, if we didn't have a continent that we were expanding into, right, as a land power and things, then there wouldn't have been all that to fight over. And our history, might look quite different than it did. But it's the fact that we're as such a large country geographically and such a diverse country demographically. And obviously people point to, today, but that trend started at the beginning. Right. I mean, there's, for all the, Nick Fuenteses of the world, and I want to talk about the Great Replacement theory and, it's, white people losing control of the country. Do you know on which census the percentage of white people started going down in this country? It's the 1800 census.
No shit.
Because the 1790 census was the first one we took, so things couldn't go up or down. So literally from the second census on, the percentage of white people has been going down in this country consistently from the founding generation on. We were a diverse country at the Revolution, and we've just simply become more diverse as time has gone on. But when I'm like, that's just the arc of American history. That's not a conspiracy. It's not anything new.
Well, and then you tie in the whole western side of the United States with Native American and the Spanish settlers, there's a reason from Colorado over, you have all these Spanish names from there to California, and people forget, my family came in.
Right. That was all Mexico once.
Yeah. No, my family came over here in the second round of conquistadors and settled in Texas, New Mexico area. And they didn't have anything to do with the Mexican-American Civil War. They were just settlers there. When America took over, they were still just settlers there. They spoke Spanish the whole time. They were pretty much untouched by it,
And again, that's what makes us unique as a country compared to other places. But it certainly doesn't make governing we the people easier, because we the people is spread out over an entire continent and really, doesn't have, as much as we like to, lie to ourselves and tell ourselves the bedtime story that that we're all one, we're not, we're one chosen country. It's kind of like found family, and you know how it is. You can have real relations with people who are not your blood that you truly treat as family. And,
Yep.
so, I mean, I do believe that at least at other points of time, we were a true political community as a country,
Right.
but not based on, we're not a nation. We're not all the same ethnic group. We don't all have the same history. We don't all speak the same language. We don't go to the same church. The whole idea of the country was, what if you had a country where those kind of things could matter to you personally, but like that reason and the principles of Republican government and equal representation and, all those wonderful sounding phrases that are in the preamble to the Constitution. What if we could build a country on ideas as opposed to what traditionally countries have been based on? And that's the radical, exceptional idea of what America is. And yet,
The battlefield of ideas.
that's setting a very, high bar for it, right? And it requires, as we were warned. I mean, when, Ben Franklin stepped out of the doors after they signed the Constitution, and the first person came up to him and asked, well, what are we going to have for a government? His response was, a republic, if you can keep it. Because the founders certainly knew that republics were a rare breed of government in the world. And when you lose one, they don't tend to come back for a long, long time, right? The Greeks lost democracy. It was 1,400 years before anybody in Greece got to vote again.
Wow.
Countries would lose their republic, and it'd be hundreds and hundreds of years before the people's voice got represented again. And so, they set us on a course to do something that was almost miraculous, and we managed to miraculously pull it off for a couple hundred years. But the fact that we're struggling to get to year 250 here, again, history tells us we shouldn't be surprised by that experiments in popular government are rare, and they tend to be shorter lived, and that, we can learn a lot by seeing how other countries that have gone on this path before us have had a hard time sustaining it over especially the extreme long term.
Yeah.
Rome, we can learn a lot by
those
studying, studying Rome. I mean, one of the questions Ty asked me to prepare for was, if you could have people, read one book to understand what everything's going on and things, what would it be? And obviously, as an American, I think my first answer is always, have you read the Constitution? Because that's a good place to start. Can't tell you how many
actually really
conversations
small.
I get into with people who are like, but my constitutional rights. And I'm always like, yeah, which ones? Love to talk about it. This is what I do for a living. They're like,
they're commercial
people have this real
constitutionalists.
sense
They can
of my
talk to you
rights,
about it for 30 seconds.
but like it's a personal idea of the Constitution and not a legal or constitutional one. And certainly there are some great books about, America, and even some of the newer ones. I just finished Justice Amy Coney Barrett's new book called Listening to the Law, which is kind of a combination, biography of her life in the law, but explaining in very, very terms that I can see being useful to average students and average folks, like how does this whole constitutional system in the Supreme Court work? And things like that. But a book I taught a couple years ago in a seminar about Rome by Mike Duncan, who might have heard, he had the History of Rome podcast that was the #1 podcast in the world for a couple years before Rogan took over that slot. But anyway, he wrote a book called The Storm Before the Storm, because of course there's so much focus on Julius Caesar and all those kind of events as being the end of the Roman Republic. But Duncan's point, which is generally the position that most academic historians take, which is that the Roman Republic had fallen long before Caesar was around. And, and that if we really want to look at why Republican government broke down, we have to go basically 100 years earlier, and go back to look at, the start of party politics in Rome, the tribuneships of the two Gracchi brothers, and then into the social war and the servile wars and Marius and Sulla, and when you start having Roman generals march Roman armies to the capital to take over, like for 100 years, the system was breaking down. And of course,
Right.
one of the things that's really notable about that is, of course, what we've come to call lawfare, which is that the Roman courts, which were really, one of the remarkable parts of their system, started to get used in really petty and partisan ways to punish people's political enemies. And unfortunately, because our Supreme Court has just delivered us the
Sounds
same
familiar.
rule, but because in Rome, the rule was, well, while you're in office, you can't be prosecuted for doing things. Only after you're in office, which of course created the incentive for politicians to refuse to give up their office because they were told they're immune. And, if you give up your office, you're going to trial. And that's a big part of the Caesar story. It was a big part of the civil wars before that. And of course, you can see the parallels in what's going on in our government now quite clearly. And so obviously we're not Rome,
Yeah.
very different historical context, but it's also clear that you look around Washington, D.C. and go, the founders kind of wanted us to be Rome, or at least an idealized version of Rome. So they were thinking
Yep.
about Rome when they wrote the Constitution. It's not inappropriate for us to think about Rome when thinking about what is working or not working in the Constitution. Again, it just gives us, more tools of understanding how a society that was, functioning at a very high level, socially and culturally and militarily could, within a few generations really just tear itself to shreds. And that's certainly what happened
I feel like
in
Rome is such a
the
good
last
case
century
study.
of Republican Rome. Yeah.
Yeah, Rome is such a good case study. Like they just in a lot of ways, like the imperialism, and I think about like our like we're kind of leaning into that a little bit, and then you have, like what you said, people working their ass off to be poor. It's like Roman society didn't matter anymore. Like the people, like their expectations, their outcomes, like it just didn't matter outside of the expansion of the republic. You know what I mean? Or the expansion of the people in power within what was supposed to be the republic. And like I see that, I see a lot of correlations in the United States. I have a lot of people asking me about that. It feels like a lot of people are like, are we going to go with the way of Rome? We may not have the Gauls come and attack us and tear us down, but like falling in a different kind of way to where we're moving from a unipolar world where we enjoyed, like you said, through the Cold War and after World War II, almost exclusive power for a long time till pretty much the fall of the Soviet Union. We were and then truly unipolar to now where it's like Iran has gotten to the point to where they're able to, with a little bit of help, like really challenge our dominance as a state globally, like for the entire world to see. And that was something that Rome started to experience, right? And they were like this undefeatable, expansionist people, military that all of a sudden out of nowhere just kind of came crashing down after having power for so long. And like the way that our society runs, like through technology and advancement, just in the in the age that we live in right now, I feel like history speeds up.
Well, even in like more recent history, you have Spain and Britain and the expansion of their empires and similar collapses, maybe some different core reasons, but they kind of took that same route, and like it's kind of funny too. It's like in most of those cases, like you also have this big social uprising that was dividing the people like right before the bricks started to really fall. It was always 50 years before there's this crazy social movement, or 100 years before, and then the bricks start to fall, and then 50 years later there's nothing left. And the comparisons just from Rome and pretty much every major empire that's colonized and spread, and then their demise. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah. And you know what? Another thing, Sean, I wanted to ask you about too. Read a lot of I'm a big fan of Madison. I love that guy. I know he was kind of the architect of the Bill of Rights, and Washington was really, he seemed in a lot of the writings that I'm reading very cautious about international relationships. You know what I mean? It
Yes.
seems like to me that he was really in his, I know in his farewell address, they would have let him be king. If he wanted to be the fucking king of the United States, they would have let him
Oh,
do it.
absolutely.
And
He
it
was
was brassy for him to
offered
be
the
like, "I'm
crown
stepping down."
very
Yeah,
early on. And yeah. And
and
again, we should
yeah,
remember that, when he came to the end of his, second term and said, no, that's enough, that that not only did he step back, but of course he, after the Revolutionary War, he'd helped found this whole organization for former officers called the Society of Cincinnatus. Because again, they knew their Roman history, right? And of course, Cincinnatus was a dictator in Rome. And again, we tend to forget that that's an actual constitutional office in the Roman Republic, where they're like, okay, the shit has hit the fan. We need to give somebody power for a short period of time to get us through this crisis or things. But then again, they had very strict rules to go, okay, at the end of that, then we put you on trial essentially to make sure that you did what you were supposed to do. And of course, Cincinnatus is one of the most famous effective dictators, where he did what he needed to do and then said, thanks y'all, and went home to his, farm and never engaged in politics again. And that was the model that Washington wanted to lead us with. And of course, again, talking about how it wasn't in the Constitution until much, much later, right? It was the sheer force of his personality to go, I'm going to step down after 2 terms. Then there didn't have to be a rule, right? When somebody tried to run for a 3rd term, then people would immediately just ask, what, you think you're better than George Washington? And of course, no politician in America wanted to say, oh, yeah, and so, nobody even attempts it until Grant, and of course, then he gets beat in his own primary. And so doesn't run for a 3rd term. Teddy runs for a 3rd term, but not from in office and from a different party, and didn't, and so, and then obviously in FDR, won 4 times, and, probably would have won a 5th. Had he lived long enough to get to that next election. But it's notable that for all the goodwill that people had towards FDR, that it was immediately after the Second World War and the death of FDR, we're like, yeah, we probably should put that rule in the Constitution now. Like we've gotten to the stage where the example of George Washington was enough to keep politicians from wanting lifetime, tenure for 170 some years. That's pretty good for one guy. But it's time to put it down in law and just say, as Americans, right, like the presidency is not meant to be a lifetime appointment. And certainly when you look back, that changed the course of American history. I mean, without a doubt, when we look back, Bill Clinton, really pretty young and very popular when he left office in 2000, clearly, if he was allowed to, would have run for election and would have probably done much better than Al Gore had done against W in that election. We should remember that Al Gore actually won that election. It was close and complicated, but we do know definitively now that there were more votes
hanging
for him.
Chads. Wasn't that the hanging Chads?
Not that more votes determines who gets to be president, right? But and then the same way, right? Obama, certainly, could have run, so I mean, you just think about how different politics could be if we didn't have that rule, and how different politics might be come 2028 if that rule just doesn't seem to to apply to one of the political parties anymore. And that's a fascinating and terrifying part of the story where we're at. So we might in fact see that be like if you would have told me 20 years ago that we'd have to have a Supreme Court case to determine that the words all people born in the United States means all people born in the United States, I would have told you there's no way that gets up to the court. Here we are. Like it was just argued last week. And even though it looks like the court is going to uphold the Constitution, it's not going to be unanimous.
Right.
Like even if it's 6-3, like there's going to be a number of Supreme Court justices that, and so again, that's why I say that I was an expert in the way this country used to work. But that just makes me a historian now rather than a political scientist, because it's certainly not the way things work anymore.
No, but I'll tell you what, like, it's really interesting when I read all this stuff about, they were really, really fearful of international alliances, specifically because of war, because they knew that we'd get pulled in. And they were also talking about, I think it was Madison who talked about like our geography being like very, or maybe it was Jefferson, very strategically located where we could avoid those international relations and avoid that international warfare just because of the location of the United States versus Europe, which was continuously getting sucked in, like Joel was talking about, France, Britain, like these other, imperial empires, even Germany to some extent, that were continuously getting pulled into skirmishes in Africa and India and Ireland and like obviously the United States and all these other places, just perpetual warfare. I'm really a big fan of James Madison. I'm really starting to really like that guy a lot, and he's got a quote here from like 1795 from political observations is what it's actually, the context. And it says, of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it compromises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debts and taxes, and armies and debts and taxes are known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. In war, too, the discretionary power of the executive is extended. This is something you talked about with Rome. Its influence in dealing out offices, honors, and I dick up this word, annulments, I missed that up, is multiplied. And all the means of seducing the mind are added to those of subduing the force of the people. No nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. And like we find ourselves in just nothing but perpetual and continual warfare, literally, like you said, Sean, since World War II, since the last time the Congress has literally authorized the war. The Korean War was considered a police action. The Vietnam War, where we lost 35,000 dudes in the Korean War, 55,000 in Vietnam, and was Vietnam also considered a police action? Was that the official?
Yeah,
I'm trying to remember. Was that so? Back-to-back police actions, almost 100,000 dudes.
Yeah, I mean the difference is again that Korea they use the cover of the UN Security Council resolution. In Vietnam, Congress did pass the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. But there again, a resolution is not the same as a declaration of war. But it was the kind of Congress going, well, we'll let the presidency take care of things here. And again, to me, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, like the War Powers resolution, is part of this whole story of Congress abdicating their responsibility.
Wasn't that the same thing in the Gulf War, the first Iraq War? Yeah. Wasn't it because they didn't see it as a thing of self-defense, but it was self-defense for Kuwait, right? And so they said, even though we didn't congressionally approve it, we basically leaned on them the same way you were saying, saying, yeah, we can do this.
Yeah, I mean, and Congress did vote. And again, it wasn't an official declaration of war, but at least there was a Congress authorization for us to defend Kuwait in the first Gulf War. And then, as there's, the notorious AMUF, the authorization for the use of military force, where we declared war on a word and a concept, terror, your war, the plural,
right?
After 9/11, and then basically every president since has just used that as a blank check. And again, at this point, you're like, that's like we've had like election cycles since that was passed. If you thought that was enough justification, why don't you just go to Congress and get another authorization of the use of military force?
Right.
But
I feel like I want Congress to at least put their name to it. You know what I mean?
Congress doesn't want to vote on this, and the president doesn't want to
because they don't want to have their name to it.
It doesn't matter. Exactly.
Yeah, they don't want to have their name on it for yay or nay. And like, I really liked what you said about when you brought up Rome, and Madison talks about this, Jefferson talks about this, I think Thomas Paine talked about this. Like, the expansion of the executive is absolute. It's absolute. Every time you go to warfare with that, and we've been seeing this, like the executive now has expanded to the point to where the Congress is literally castrating itself on purpose, it seems like. And
it's why scholars refer to it in the 20th century as the imperial presidency, because from the Second World War on, and again, people will argue for that because look at how effective, the powers of the presidency were to win the Second World War. And the Cold War and everything. And, there's some arguments to be made there, and certainly have been some effective uses of American power in the 20th century. But none of that changes the fact that it's completely divorced from the framers' scheme. And so if we want to become a different country and have a different approach to war, then we should amend the Constitution. I guess that, that's, I sound like a stick in the mud on those kind of things, but like, that's, the framers also gave us to do that, but it's not impossible to amend the Constitution. And so from a functional standpoint, in fact, interestingly, that's another good book I've
But you know what you
read
get from both
recently.
sides? What you get from both sides, Sean, what you get from both sides, and this is what so whenever people are like, yeah, Trump didn't, they're like, well, Obama didn't either, and Biden didn't either, and Bush didn't either. And it's like, you get these
What about it?
teams. It's the Bloods and the Crips. Like the conservatives are the Bloods, the Democrats are the Crips. And it's like they're perpetually using the examples of people leading the other team to say, see, we can do this too because they were doing it, rather than just being like, you know what? Why don't you be the team that adheres to those principles so we can get away from this stuff? Because that's what the perpetual argument is, at least on my side. Because when I get all these guys that are still super duper Trump, the first thing they'll tell me is they're like, well, Obama did it, so why can't Trump do it? And it's like, nobody's saying that was fucking good when Obama did it either, or Reagan or Bush won, or any of these other people either. And it's like you get into this weird argument with people to where it's a team, it's a color, it's a team backing of a color. You're cheering for the New York Yankees, and it doesn't matter at that point. And we get up in this goddamn circle where you're just coming back to the same thing over and over again, rather than being like, yeah, they're all fucking wrong, all of them. And that's where I find myself out now.
I think part of that's been told because how many people just say they're voting for the lesser of two evils, like, and it's like the pendulum just swings. It's like when Texas voted against the abortion thing, before they went and cut Roe v. Wade. I didn't like the precipice that sent, because I was like, so let's say Colorado says that against the Second Amendment, and it says like, well, we want to, each party pushes that line, and then the next party is like, okay, this is okay for me to do it because I push this line, and then it's tough also when you have things that are done federally that, like Roe v. Wade was written bad. And there's been a lot of Democrats who talked about that for a long time. Not to say that I'm pro abortion. Like, I'm not anti-abortion, so anybody who cares. But I think there's this dichotomy of people move the line on either party. No one's willing to keep their party acceptable as long as their party's doing it. Like it just makes that pendulum swing further and further.
Yeah, you're 100% right, because people don't hold. That's the problem. Like, if it's Trump, I backed Trump 3 times. I voted for the dude 3 times. You know what I'm saying? And I understand that that's retarded. I understand it. I get it, but it was for a different reason, really, too. You know what I'm saying? Like, it was to try to be outside of that typical political norm that ended up being way, way more like when we're seeing in the second term, like way pushed harder against what we were actually trying to achieve than what we got. And so, Sean, when we talk about like American imperial overreach and how we're working so hard now, do you think that imperial overreach is where we started to really go wrong as a society or as a government, or as a representational government? Because it seemed when we started to really push out like that, and the founders were really explicit about this with alliances and all this other stuff. And I understand that we're in 2026 now and we're not, in the 18th century anymore. But I also believe that there's a lot of things that we could do if we were willing to do it to curtail some of this stuff. And I think that if there's one good thing that could come out of this Iran debacle, might actually be adhering to the principles that they're laying out and reconsolidating in the American project back home. Do you know what I'm saying? Because I feel like our imperial
Yeah.
overreach is really, really kind of at the heart of the problem that we've had of where we're at between losing rights, expansion of government, expansion of the executive, the war stuff. We're basically, God, I mean, we're a war society. In a lot of ways, we're a war economy. And I wonder if that imperial overreach is kind of like the foundation of the beginning of the end. You know what I mean? What do you think about that?
I think it's certainly one of the big drivers. I think, and again, you can, put your historical goggles on and go, you can understand why the changes that were made in the 40s and 50s that led to just constant growth of the national security state in the context of where the world was then, in the context of, a potential hot, Cold War turning hot and all those kind of things. So to me, the real wrong turns, because of course we that was pretty well understood and was certainly, from an academic point of view, I mean, that's what people were studying in the 70s and 80s. The ungovernability of the American Republic, right? The imperial presidency, all of these kind of, problems. And of course, also the economic problems tracing back to stagflation in the 70s and the oil crisis and those kind of things. Obviously, like, we still managed to win the Cold War, right? What we did was lose the peace. I look back to the 1990s, because in the 1990s we really had a
We won the Cold
chance
War, but we lost
to
the
set.
peace. That's another great quote.
Yeah.
Yep. That's a great quote.
Well, and again, and when you think about just, how different, and of course you can make mistakes in the other way too, but historically, I mean, certainly after the Civil War, like, we basically completely stripped the military establishment back to, the bare bones, and most of it focused on, the army out west. And then and we had to rebuild the military when it came to the Spanish American. Well, that's why we just like took, hey, you guys got horses and guns, let's go, invade Cuba. That's why we had volunteer units like the Rough Riders and things, because we didn't have a full professional military establishment in 1898. Certainly then we had to rebuild it for the first war. But then World War, we just kept building it up. And, and that's
Yeah.
the point in time where the dynamic what we'd always have for build up the military when we need to fight, and then, disband it and go back down to a bare bones defense force when we didn't need to. Well,
Yeah,
we've
that's
never
100%
cut the
accurate.
military since the Second World War. Yeah. So.
Yeah, like after the Second World War, you had a lot of units that were stood up, including Ranger units, just from, my alma mater, that got disbanded immediately after the war. You know what I mean? And there was like reconnaissance units, sniper team units, all those units that were stood up for those big conflicts were immediately basically extinguished. And it took basically, I guess it was Robert Kennedy, JFK, not Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, who stood up the special operations community kind of permanent right before the Vietnam War, when he stood up the Green Berets and SEALs. And then the Rangers kind of came after that and then got disbanded again after Vietnam. And so they've been kind of like trying to adhere to that a little bit, but like as time has gone by, it's just slowly kept growing and growing and growing and growing until now we're asking for a $1.5 trillion defense budget. You know what I mean? That's wild.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at that budget proposal that came out last week, that there's the pudding. Like, if we're going to run our country this way, then we can't have nice things. Because the things that go boom are very expensive, and if we're going to have 20 times as much of them spend as much in military spending as the next 17 countries combined, when 15 of them are our allies, or at least they used to be our allies. You know,
Yeah.
that's going to be the
Yep.
other, long-term situation here is, um, is that everything that we worked so hard to build after the Second World War in terms of an international security structure and an alliance structure, and all of that has been shattered for no real good reason here. But in some ways, you know maybe the part of the silver liner will be, I'm not sure the American military is going to be welcome in Europe after this. And if we have to pull
Doesn't
back
seem
from
like
all
it.
those big, and again, Southeast Korea, Japan, some of those other places too. And, and maybe that would be good for us in the long term, because in some ways, because our empire is a military empire, that if other countries aren't willing to, host our troops and with status forces agreements the way we've had, where we'd have to actually follow, because, other countries, when they have foreign bases, are expected to follow the rules of the host country, right? We as Americans are always like, no. Like, as right, we create these status of forces agreements so that soldiers, don't find themselves in the local law enforcement and all those other things. And obviously that facilitates our ability to project power. But it also, has created long-term, bad feelings in many countries and that are our allies because of bad behavior of U.S. personnel on base and things. And it, as you guys well know, I mean, you throw a bunch of young boys, train them up to be the world's greatest warriors, and they blow off a little. They're not exactly altar boys at that point. And we don't. For what we need you to be,
Yep.
right? To be the tip of the spear and be our operators. That's what we need. But when we dump those in large numbers in other people's civilian countries, they tend to get a little upset when we break the furniture and knock up their daughters, and all the variety
Yep.
of things that are not unique to American soldiers abroad. They're the experience of soldiers abroad throughout all of history in all countries, but certainly, those kind of things which used to always get overridden by their governments because of security concerns. I'm not sure, and again, you think about even the countries that are closer to us now, like the Gulf monarchies and things. How did that go for them to have American troops in their neck of the woods when they're a lot closer to Iran than we are? Well, Iran's
Exactly.
not dropping missiles into Los
No
Angeles because they
security.
can't, but they sure can drop them in
Mhm.
Qatar, right? And Bahrain and the
Yep.
UAE and all these places, and and of course they're punching back, at military targets in the middle of a war, which obviously I'm on our side. I want us to win, but also you can understand from the other perspective, well, they didn't start the war. I mean, this talk of we've been at war for 47 years. I mean, that goes back to then from that perspective,
It's a
then we're
pretty
at war with
one-sided
anybody
war.
we want at any time. We've always been at war with Eurasia. Our allies in East Asia have always been. No, we've always, yeah. Orwell warned us about this too, right? Speaking of other good books that wouldn't be bad for people to read. Animal Farm. In fact, there's a new cartoon version of Animal Farm I just saw that's coming out. I'll be real curious. Did you ever see they did a cartoon version of it in the 50s, and by they I mean the CIA. Um, of course, under an assumed name. And amazingly, the
Right?
end of the book is quite different in the CIA approved version, right?
Imagine that.
Go figure.
Imagine that, exactly. But so yeah, I mean, I love my country, but we certainly have some explaining to do when it comes to propaganda and
Mhm.
violating our own rules and violating other people's countries and things. That's part of our story too. And as Americans, we kind of have to embrace that and find some way to both accept our history and yet move forward and again try to be better than that's always been part of what America was always about, was trying to be better, that the next generation will be
Right?
better, that it'll be better for my kids than it was for me. I know for you that's and as every parent, that's a huge concern these days, is just looking at an America
Yep.
where statistically speaking, the next generation's going to take it up the shorts.
Well, this is the
Oh, yeah.
first time too that through like testing, and I'm not a big fan of standardized testing, but we're gonna have a population coming into like college age who's gonna be I mean, this is elegant, but is gonna be dumber and is gonna make less money than the next generation. That's the first time in American history that's ever been the case.
Yep. No, it's,
Yeah.
as much as I hate all these trends, I also feel like living in truth with my students is part of the principles that I live by. And so I frequently have to tell them this bad news, all the time that, again, it used to be that reliably that all college graduates say had lower unemployment than non-college graduates. We are now officially in a mode this year where all college graduates, regardless of what you graduate in, probably have worse unemployment than high school graduates.
Right.
It's at least true for the top 37 majors in the country. So, I mean, it's pretty universal. Yeah. And given that most students on most campuses only major in about 4 of those things, right? Yeah. So,
Right.
um,
But you want to live in truth,
and,
man. You don't
we've
want to.
told people that they need to pay all this money to go to college and they will guarantee them a great job and things. And again, you look at the statistics on, most college graduates are underemployed, meaning that they work jobs that they could have got without the college diploma. And again, in the old days where college might take a few years and cost you, a few $100s out of pocket, and you can work a summer job and get by, that wasn't too bad of a trade-off in my parents' generation, right? But that's not the way it works today. I mean, people are going into massive amounts of debt, and the debt that's one of the hardest forms of debt to get rid of because of the way bankruptcy laws were written. As I always do feel the need to point out that, the senator that wrote that bankruptcy law, his name was Joseph Robinette Biden. As we used to call him, the senator from MBNA, because, Delaware is where so many banks and corporations are headquartered. And as their U.S. senator for many years, he took care of those constituencies. Again, that's, I guess I feel a little like tying in reverse. I'll be honest. I voted for Biden in 2020, as much as I hated it doing it, knew I'd regret it. I certainly have regretted it. But again, people get, forced in both directions to feel like, oh, it's the lesser of two. You're like, I just, and what we learn over and over is the lesser of two evils is evil. And, if people are choosing for whatever reason evil in every election cycle, then certainly then their political opponents start to see them not as fellow citizens and as competing, political party, but as them, us and them.
Right.
And once, and that's again, going back to, human nature, like, we're apes that stand up and use tools. But like the us and them thing, that's wired into our DNA from the very beginning. And, and again, going back to Madison, he warned, Federalist number 10 about faction, man. Faction is a problem, and it's what's brought down most republics. But as he says, a faction, right, in order to get rid of faction, people dividing up into us and them, you either have to take away liberty from everybody, or you have to force a common opinion on everybody. Neither of those two things has anything to do with the free society. And so Madison said, this is a problem, but we need to build things to protect from the effects because we can't get rid of this problem. He said, even if you got rid of, all other clubs and associations and things, you're always going to have the haves and the have-nots. There's never been a society that was not divided between a small group of people that had a lot of stuff and a large group of people that didn't. That's just the nature of human societies. And so, we have to learn to live with people who are not our friends and family and don't agree with us. I mean, that's the whole reason politics was invented, was because as long as you keep society small where everybody's related, then you can govern it like a family because you're all an extended family. But once your neighbors are not your friends and family, once they're just someone who's another citizen who lives on the other side of the fence, you got to come up with reasons to deal with one another. And, and again, going back to the Greeks, that's why they thought, well, luckily human beings, in addition to all of our animal traits, also have some traits like we can speak and reason with each other. Because
I
without that,
Right.
we'd have no chance. But that doesn't make it easy. It makes it, a lifetime of hard work to learn how to deal with other people. And we just simply have, not prepared the American people to have those civic skills to be able to have a real disagreement and not be disagreeable. And yet that's what Republican government requires. And that's why it's not going so well right now, because we just don't have a citizenry that is up to it. And, the political class, we should never look to the political class to solve the people's problems. But when the people are so incapable of having a civil discussion, then it just encourages the worst possible creatures. And that's what we've ended up with, right? Is just grifters and criminals and sycophants and people that just are in it for the fame, and people that are just using it to get rich. And of course there's always been those elements, and they've always touched our politics. But as I say, right, P.T. Barnum ran a circus. We didn't elect him president. Like, and today we would, right?
well,
Today we elect,
Totally
we
would.
re-elected a reality TV star president
Damn it, Sean,
because
you're right.
people can't distinguish. And the first thing you hear from people was because he's a great businessman. No, you watched him on TV playing a businessman. That's how most of the American people was introduced to Donald Trump. And that's not a good way to pick your leaders. It wasn't a good way to pick your leaders when, and that's why I cringe when the Democrats go, well, we should run Oprah or, somebody to just equally famous on the other side. And I'm like, well, if you do that, then there won't be any more hope, for the country. But I don't know how we get back to, because, serious politicians just look like politicians to the American people right now, and nobody wants that. And yet without a serious political class who can actually cut deals with people they don't agree with, I don't know how we, make the sausage. So we're in a rough spot.
well, and it's kind of crazy too, and this is like a little sidetrack, but I just watched a thing on Neanderthals and humans, and it was talking about like why they think humans became the ones who took over, and they're starting to find that some of these autism genes are related to like Neanderthal DNA, and what they're hypothesizing is that humans worked better together. Neanderthals had small units. They, as far as the brain development, they're on the same pace as us as tools, stuff like that, and um, humans worked better together in a social structure, so they're able to unite and take over. And there's a bunch of other stuff going on, climate change, all the, I mean, obviously it wasn't just that easy, but we were
But that
able to,
ability to organize yourself into more complex social forms,
yeah,
is increasingly the answer that evolutionists give for why Homo sapiens became the dominant, version. Although, again, they've also found that we coexisted with Neanderthals and other earlier forms of humans for far longer than we used to think was the case. That
yeah,
it wasn't just like a couple of
Denisovans
generation
for a long time
turnover.
too.
It's hundreds of generations, but that seems to be, again, and it's, when you look at us as animals, it's hard to explain how we became the apex predator on this planet, right? Like you look at a grizzly bear, or a lion or a tiger and go, well, I don't want to pick a fight with one of those. But our superpower is our ability to gang up and use tools. So, you put 20 humans together with some sharpened sticks and rocks and, and the ability to, light a fire and, run things out of the forest and then stab them on the other end. Like that's our superpower. Unfortunately, we're really good at turning it on ourselves.
Yeah, we're really, really good at that. And going back to your, I kind of have this. I feel like the best, or I should say, the most violent weapon system that's ever been devised in history is just young males, like you were talking about before. Um, it's like
Young men with no prospects is a
correct.
danger And that's increasingly what we're seeing. We should take a note from the fact that the reason we've been constantly involved in the Middle East militarily in the last 40 or 50 years is that those are societies where the largest group of people are men under 25 and men
Yep.
that don't have a lot of prospects. I always point back to,
Mhm.
when we think, this analysis, of course, and everything else and people's emotional reactions. But when you go back and take a sobering look at 9/11, right? 19 hijackers, 15 of those guys had college engineering degrees because they were told, just like Americans are now, work hard, study hard, go to school, and there'll be a good paying job and you can get married and have a family and have a good life. And they did everything that they were told to do, went to school and got those degrees, and there weren't no jobs. Without jobs, right? There's no
Yep.
prospects for so you got a lot of pissed off, young men who were promised a better life and given no means to get it. And that's where radicalization it comes as easiest. And we have very much created many of those same kind of situations among young men in our country, and we should be scared shitless because of it.
Well,
Oh,
and I
absolutely.
mean,
Absolutely.
they even talk about in the Epstein files, like, weaponizing that thing. Like, we
Yeah.
need to find, like, the young men, and it was with Steve Bannon talking about, like, weaponizing it was right after the Me Too movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, so they were already kinda angsty, and then they took advantage of it, you know? And, yeah, and it goes the other side as well, you know? Young minds are moldable, and when you feel like society's breaking down, you're gonna pick a side, you know?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, and you're certainly seeing that among young people in both directions. But the interesting trend is that young people are, every bit as divided ideologically and politically as older generations are. But the one hope that
Right.
the younger people give me is that younger people aren't as bought into the parties and the party labels as our
Right.
older generations. So I think that if we can somehow find our way through this and offer different alternatives to people, that that younger people are looking for those different alternatives, whether it's directly in politics or, as we were talking about, in their media diet where they get their news from, those kind of things. And and the upside to all the scary research on the kind of loneliness of young people today, especially young men, and the divides between young men and young women, which have never been as extreme as they are in this country politically. And that, that politics is just the lens everybody sees everything through, and it's, I mean, and now it's, I
Mhm.
mean, that's the primary reason people do or don't date other people is politics. And that's led to a
Right.
huge decline in, it weirds me out as a college professor, right? College students, right? For thousands of years, colleges have tried to get students to not get drunk and not have sex. And no one has ever succeeded at those two things on a college campus until this generation, where if we gave them extra credit and tuition waivers for partying and like hooking up with each other, they would. It is so, like, there is
Crazy.
almost no dating that happens, among college students these days. There's almost no partying that happens among, like, and because of that, like,
Wow.
the students I see, I mean, they're not living their best lives. And and a lot of them feel, you can just tell, you're like, you don't even seem like you want to be here. And I hear just a lot of, well, I don't. My parents said I had to come to college because I can't afford to just buy a place on my own. And my parents said I can't live at home unless I go to school. And I know that a lot of parents
Right.
do that thinking they're doing what's best for their kids. But there comes a point where, I just see so many people are just being shuffled through the door to something that is very expensive. It is not necessary for everybody, despite, what your high school guidance counselor might tell you. I mean, even to this day, 70% of the American people are not college graduates. And that's the highest number of college grads we've ever had. Um, but there's all this social pressure and economic pressure. and me having to do this, and it breaks my heart because I still very much idealistically believe in the idea of a higher education as a place where it is a luxury to be able to go off to college and be able to kind of put off the real world for a couple of years, or at least back out of the real world for a couple of years before you go back in. If you've, if you didn't come straight from high school, so that you have time to devote to figuring out who you are and what you believe and the things that are just hard to do once you get into a job and all the rest of it. But that's doesn't seem to be happening now too, just because everybody just is in this existential fight or flight mode, where they don't feel like they're able to make choices. They feel like they're just pawns that are being moved around by these big social forces of technology and the economy and politics and everything else. And for a lot of them, they just don't understand those forces. And so it feels very disempowering, I think, for a lot of young people. And again, then when someone comes along and goes, I feel your pain and just, come with me, and it's their fault. Because that's always the next thing. Like, it's real pain. Like, people are in real pain. And if people don't take that serious, it's a huge mistake the Democratic Party has made, is in embracing, the financial class and, global markets and all that kind of neoliberal stuff that we first got from Reagan, but then certainly got every bit as much from Clinton and Obama as we ever did from the Republicans that started that kind of policies, that just left working people feeling like these people don't care about me at all. And what was once, a party that was, strongly based in working people, now, we've just ended up in a weird situation where you can understand why those people you know, can't find it very hard to identify with the Democratic Party. But on the other hand, for all the propaganda about a turn towards the common people on the Republican side, again, whether it's the war we've been talking about or tax policy or anything, I'm like, that's the story that's told before Election Day.
Right.
But now we've seen the story over and over again about what happens after Election Day. And it sure as hell ain't about setting up this country so that the average everyday working man and woman can get ahead. And unless one of the parties starts to actually really address those issues, then politics will be, reduced to the fact that it's, Yankees versus Red Sox. And except, and sometimes that happens in sports, but in politics, Yankees versus Red Sox often leads to Yankees killing Red Sox and vice versa.
Right.
And so and we is interesting, but politics is about what you're willing to kill and die for, and more importantly, what you're willing to send other people to kill and die for. And
Correct.
that's why we should take it a lot more seriously than we do, because
I think we're going to end up
end
taking it real serious
existential.
probably here pretty soon. Yeah. And like,
we're going to be forced to, unfortunately.
That's interesting you say about the college kid thing, because that's so much different than my experience in college. And I was contracting off and on and leaving and coming back and stuff. But yeah, that's just wildly different than what like my experience was, for sure. And to kind of, I don't know, maybe like look forward and close this sucker out a little bit. You spoke at the No Kings rally in Missoula, which was a badass speech, by the way. I saw the video and everything, and
I did.
It was freaking
Thank
awesome.
you. Yeah, it was not something I sought out, but not surprisingly, it was a former student of mine. It was on one of the organizing committees that reached out to me, and I tend to have a hard time saying no to my former students. It's
right.
As you
But the
know, from the
turnout
day
looked,
when
the turnout looked,
yeah, I mean
amazing.
there's
Like,
there's
there was
been an
people on
interesting debate
overpass.
in the week since about how big it was, because
Mhm.
we don't know exactly, because counting crowd size is kind of a silly exercise, but certainly there were more people than there were at the No Kings 2 rally, and in Missoula that was 8,000 people back in October, and so the estimates range from 10,000 to 15,000 depending. Certainly the biggest crowd I've ever spoken in front of before, and I talk in front of crowds for a living, and But it was, it was kind of awe-inspiring to see, thousands of people up on the Higgins Bridge and thousands of people in, in Caris Park. And so it was, it was kind of, it was a humbling experience to get up and talk in front of that many people. And I, for the
Right.
most part, tried to stay in my ivory tower and not get too directly involved in politics in my adult life, just because, I've increasingly been grumpy about how our politics has gone. But we've just hit a point where, the question will always be where, if we get past it and somebody asks you, well, what side were you on? And,
Right.
as much as,
Yep.
politics doesn't work great when we get to the point of just having to divide up in sides. In some ways, you got to stand up and be counted for the country you want to have. And again, for, just, to me, it feels like the country that was handed to me by generations, that I'm not able to hand that to the next generation. And that, that
Correct. Yep.
is crushing. And especially,
Yeah.
I think,
100%.
it's a weird position to be a Gen Xer in America, because, we were kind of we were the generation that were too cool for school and didn't want to sell out. And I'll be honest, that was, a lot of my staying out of active politics, as I've, once I became an academic, is kind of part of the, well, politics is about compromise, and I'd rather, talk about justice and than have to do that. But if you leave politics to the people that are, perfectly fine with the dirty hands nature of it, then you don't end up with the best political class. And so I just felt
Right.
like I had to, had too much of what, of all the great things about this country that were handed down to me from previous generations of Americans, and particularly, my family. And that's why, I kind of framed that speech around the fact that, that I come from a mixed marriage that almost wouldn't be possible, these days. My mom was a liberal Democrat, my
Right.
dad a conservative Republican, and those kind of people aren't getting married and having kids in 2026.
Right.
And I really look
Right.
back and think that a lot of my upbringing, comes from the fact that we could disagree. We had disagreements at home and at the coffee table, and my parents supported different parties, and were both elected officials and involved in everything. And yet, politics was contained enough that didn't destroy a family or carve them in half. And you just, and I know it's happened in my family too, but you talk to so many people about how awkward Thanksgiving and Christmas and Easter and family gatherings and things have got, because you go, well, the whole family's there, then that means the blue part of the family and the red part of the family. And, and just, it's torn communities apart. It's torn states apart. It's torn, families apart. And, it's,
Yeah.
we can do
100%.
better. We have to
Well,
do better. Yes.
yeah.
I
I'll
agree
tell you
on
what,
that.
all's not lost with that. Yeah, because my wife and I, that's exactly how we met, was political debate. And like we had hours and hours of conversations, and she was on the left and I was on the right, and we both centered up. And then I ended up going more left and she ended up going more right. And it ended up kind of being an interesting thing. But I've been noticing, like, even here at, like, where I at with this No Kings thing, before it was kind of just, I think society, at least our society, would just view that as like, that was a left wing, organization or protest. But I don't see that anymore. Like, even when I saw the video with your speech, and I've been seeing it here locally, like, it seemed to me like there was a lot more of, like, kind of a collaboration of a lot of different ideals and political thoughts and theories and desired outcomes, that weren't just to the left. Do you know what I'm saying? It seemed like there was a lot of libertarian leaning people
Yeah,
and right
I mean,
leaning
and
people.
again, just locally,
Mhm.
and having seen, and particularly looking at all the signs and things that people brought, I think that's partially the reason why the No Kings 3, events, in March were bigger everywhere. And of course, you get a lot of focus
Yeah,
on in the big cities, and of course, I had some really really big marches. But what's notable to me is there were like 3,300 protest locations across the country, and like over 2,000 of them were in small rural places. So I mean, there was a No Kings protest here in Dillon. There were no there. Like one of the news. I guess it just had a reporter there, but like they covered like there were like 300 people protesting in Driggs, Idaho. Right, and
Wow,
just
that's a small
places that
town too. That's a
historically are
really
not
small
where
town.
you see protests about anything, much
Yeah.
less this.
Driggs is a small town.
And certainly I got
Yeah.
that sense in Missoula, and of course, Missoula is the bluest city in 1,000 miles, and from a voting perspective. So, and honestly, that was one of the first questions I had when they asked me. I was like, what exactly are we protesting, and who are we protesting to in Missoula? I'm like, 85% of the electorate already votes blue. Like, who are you trying to convince? And what
Right.
sold me on it was that at least in the local protest, they were like, no, we've decided that, even though some of the organizations are clearly partisan that are participating, that they wanted to keep the No Kings rally itself strictly nonpartisan, because they were seeing that, and particularly, I think when you look at all the signs and the people that were driven there because of the war, and the Epstein files and some of those things. I don't remember seeing those kind of signs and those kind of issues being nearly as prominent, in the previous rallies. So I think there definitely was a kind of different vibe, and certainly at least, and again, Montana's kind of, got aging demographics in a lot of ways, so that's not surprising, but it was remarkably intergenerational. There were a
That's what I
lot
mean.
of, a lot of folks that came up to me and were like, I worked on this advocacy project with your dad in the 70s, and, or, people that, that my mom had worked with at the Jeanette Rankin Peace Center, or, so people that are, baby boomers, that were still there, and they're, and then lots of people, and a bunch of my former teachers and people that are older than me. And yet there was, as you would expect at most protests, a lot of young people, a lot of college students out and things too. But it was a much more mixed group than I think than some of them have been in the past. And I'll be honest, I remain somewhat, skeptical about, how much impact these protests can have if they're not
Right.
connected to more, direct, action, both in terms of, electoral politics, but also I know there's some of the same organizers of the No Kings rally are trying to see if they, have enough pull to pull together like a, a national strike day or something. And obviously we haven't seen something like that in this country in a long, long time. And if,
That would be really interesting.
as far as
That'd be
impact,
something else.
that could be quite interesting. I mean, certainly, single day general strikes and things are used in a lot of European democracies by the populace when they really want to get the government's attention and just go. Or I mean, just I don't know if you've been following what's going on in Ireland this week, but obviously, they pay for gas at the pump just like everybody else, and
Right.
and gas, and particularly diesel, have just gotten unbelievable. And so when you're in an EU country where the tax structure is far less advantageous to the price of gas than it is in the United States, like farmers and things are just like can't afford it. And so, much like you saw all the truckers in Canada, show up in the capital, all of a sudden, all the tractors in Ireland, are in downtown, Dublin and Galway and things, holding up traffic this week because they're trying to make it clear. And some of the Sinn Féin and some of the other parties that are outside of government are calling for a short-term tax holiday on gas and petrol, just because literally people can't afford to get to work or to do their jobs, without, the world runs on oil, and we
Yeah, it's a big
just,
problem, man.
chose to start a war
It's a
in
big problem.
the major oil producing region. And again, that's, well, we don't get our oil from the Straits, or like, it's an undifferentiated product, man. Like, there's a price of oil. It doesn't matter where you get it from in the world. Like, the price of our oil
Right.
goes up too, which again is good if you're an American oil company that has oil, but it ain't good for
Man, if you're in
consumers
West Texas,
in
you're killing it
America.
right now.
Right. Exactly. And it ain't good for consumers anywhere. And so, in countries that are not even, involved in the slightest bit directly in the conflict are having to pay the cost for it too. And that's, it's tearing everybody apart. And the longer that it goes, the harder it's going to be, because we haven't even seen the real inflationary effects
It's
yet.
only been a month. It's only been 30 days.
This could easily drive us back into the kind of inflation numbers we saw in 22 coming out of the pandemic. And, we saw what happened to society and to our economy when inflation was pushing 10%.
But like moving forward into the next realm, how the fuck do we get out of this, Sean? Like, that's like my last question to you is based on your experience with young people, talking in front of crowds, like you said, you're able to kind of, you have a hand on the pulse, unlike a lot of other people do, being able to see that you kind of, in a way, you can kind of see the future with what you do. Like, where do we go is there anything we can do you think, like proactively as humans, as Americans, to somehow, some way get a handle on this? Do you, like, if you were the king of the world, the king of America, like what would you do? What do you think?
Well, I suppose I'm already on record as not wanting kings in America, but if I was king for a day,
true. If you're like George Washington, you give it up right
that
away as soon as it's better.
Yeah, well, honestly, I became a college professor and not a politician because I wasn't sure that I'm a good enough man to give up power if I had it. I feel very much, like that line Gandalf has in the Fellowship of the Ring, where goes, "Don't give me the ring. Like, I would try to do good things. I promise I would, but you shouldn't trust me to do good things because that much power can corrupt anybody."
Right.
But if I could say, if we could start one place, we need better choices. Like, that's what I hear from students. Like, they're completely turned off by politics, and we can't afford to have them turned off by politics. We need to have everybody showing up and to really have the American people get to have the say. And to do that, we need to give people better choices where it's not the lesser of two evils at the ballot box. And, I think the simple, the single best thing that we could do as a country would be to use ranked choice voting, because that, it's our electoral system that keeps it from being viable for third parties to emerge. The only time third parties have emerged in American history and been able to institutionalize themselves is if one of the two major parties dies, right? And they can basically take over from that's how, when we lost the Federalists, then, we didn't have parties, era of good feelings and all that kind of stuff. But within one cycle, then you had the Whigs get organized. And then, and when the Whigs, fell apart over the slavery issue, and you had small parties like the Free Soilers and things like that eventually, consolidate into the Republican Party, then we were back to having, our system, tends to favor a two-party system. Now, as a constitutionalist, I've always thought that that's not the best system, because the danger has always been in a two-party system. If the country is divided basically down the middle, politics ceases to work. And I think that's what we've seen in the last 10 years, because we essentially have two big camps, neither of which can win an election by anything more than, the smallest hair, that whatever happens then gets erased 2 years later. And like, you can't actually do anything big in politics if you can't win, bigger than that. But I think, a situation where people have other options, where it's viable to vote. And again, it's not necessarily going to be nationwide, but like in a lot of the, really red states where the Democrats don't compete, in ranked choice voting, you'd have libertarians that you might have other forms of non-Republican conservatives, and so you might have different, multi-party systems in different areas of the country. But by the same token, in the blue states where Republicans don't compete that well, the Democrats should have to face competition from the DSA or other kind, a real
Green
Labor
Party or
Party
something
or
like that. Yeah.
or things like that. And I think that kind of competition in both directions would be really helpful, and that in the places that we've seen it happen, it has been helpful. I mean, and it's interesting that the places that have adopted that are all over the political spectrum. I mean,
Right.
deeply red Alaska has ranked choice voting. Utah has ranked choice voting now. So does
Really?
Maine,
Huh.
yeah. So, and it's,
Cool.
it's deeply frustrating to me that the Republican Party in Montana has just declared that is, anathema to them. Because again, I remember that, in Montana, I'm like, well, you're winning elections now, but give it another 10 years. Like, no party has been able to dominate Montana. We're not a red state. We're not a blue state. We're a tie-dyed purple state, not because we're full of purple people, but because we have a good political system that encourages us to transfer power back and forth. I mean, I've told people I've lived half my life under Republican governors, half my life under Democratic governors, half my life under Republican legislatures in Montana, half my life under Democratic legislatures in Montana. Until 2 years ago, I'd never lived a day without a Democratic U.S. senator, but I've also had a Republican
Right.
congressman for almost, again, that's kind of how, I think it's supposed to work. And so of all the things we could do, I mean, and that doesn't require a constitutional amendment. That's the other thing, is there's all sorts of things we could do. And maybe it'd be fun sometime just from a legal standpoint, to talk about the things we could maybe do to amend the Constitution to help fix some of these problems. But the truth is we have to fix our politics first, because if constitutional amendments are impossible right now, and a convention might do more harm than good. So, something like getting back to, and again, it goes back to all the problems with gerrymandering. If we go back to the original plan of Madison at the convention, right? Members of Congress were not supposed to be divided up into districts. The whole idea of the scheme of it being based on population was that they would be elected in the whole state. And of course, a way you could do that is if you had ranked choice voting, then you can have every party runs as many people for as many, like in Montana, you have 2 congressmen. In a big state, you have 50 some. But every party could have a candidate for every one of those offices. And then you let the American people say, who's my first choice, my second choice, my third choice. And what you'd end up with is, it wouldn't be one side that wins them all. You'd end up with a Congress with multiple parties. And then, like other, mature democracies, people would have to learn to go, okay, none of us can govern alone. So I guess we're going to make a deal with this other party. And they don't want exactly what we do, but we can, find the Venn diagram where we agree enough to have a government. We'll try it. And if it doesn't work, then you have new elections and try something new. I mean, I think we need to get back to that experimental nature of democracy. But when every election feels like it's going to be the end of the world, if your side doesn't win, we can't just continue to live in that space. So that would be my 2 cents for the best single thing to do. Yes.
Freaking excellent.
I got one real quick thing. And we've talked about this in past podcasts. There's a couple think tanks out there that have done a bunch of bipartisan research, and they found essentially that almost 70% of the people agree, or on a spectrum, we agree on about 70% of things when it comes to voting, and we let this 30% split us up. And the DNC and RNC, that's intentional to do that, and he actually has politicians signing, and it's called like the 70% plan. It's where these politicians, where like they are, hopefully we're getting away from some of that, because people are starting to see that like this identity politics, and like this is what it's leading to, until we're able to have a third party system, or when more than half the country gets along and agrees on 70% of the stuff, and we're still at the same point, and that's why nothing moves through Congress, because you have 50% of the Congress, it's broken, and it's been broken for the last 20 years, especially.
Yeah, and unfortunately, in our system, unlike a parliamentary system, there's just no easy means for doing that kind of grand bargain compromise in electoral
Right.
politics.
Right.
I know that,
Mhm.
if I think back to, 2016, just seeing this train wreck coming, that we were going to end up with a Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump election. I mean, quite literally, although we, don't have polling that goes all the way back to the founders, but in
Yeah.
the age where we've had polling about politicians, those are the two least popular politicians in American history. So when people say, like, that can't
Yep.
be my choice, they have a point there, right? Like you would, knowing that those were going to be the two choices, I was, hoping for some, unicorn to ride out of the blue and to get some kind of compromise ticket where you'd take, a blue governor from a red state like Steve Bullock was in Montana, and combine him with, the ticket I had ideally in my mind there was Bullock and Justin Amash. You remember Justin Amash was a congressman from Michigan, and was a Republican, but was like a really principled, liberty facing, and it was the first Republican congressman to turn on Trump, and of course then got primaried and pushed out of Congress by Trump, very early on. But there are individual politicians you can imagine that could make a deal like that. The problem is that because the individual parties in every state, whichever state controls the Secretary of State's office, it's the Republicans or the Democrats and never anybody else that controls state elections. We don't have nationalized elections in this country, and I don't think it would be good if we did. But the fact is that that the parties are in too much control of the actual electoral process to make any kind of easy, path to an end of, and again, that's the misleading part about this, because you get some people like, well, really, if, 70% of people are more centrist, then why don't we run somebody well, 40% of the American people are clear they're not Republicans or Democrats. It does not mean they're centrists on everything.
Right.
It just means that they've opted out of our bad political system. And if they were given another option to vote, they certainly would. I'm the same way. Like I said, I've been, quote unquote, wasting my ballots for president for a long, long time because I couldn't bear the thought of casting a ballot for either of the options I was being given from the two major parties. And then the one time I got convinced that, I had to make a choice, then I've regretted it ever since, because, that's, we need better choices. And I think anything we can do that would increase that, right up to the fact that, honestly, is, even though there are good members of Congress and, ones that are doing the people's business, like if we just started from scratch and said, we just, like, everybody out, let's rebuild the government from scratch. Honestly, I think that kind of idea could get on with the American people. But neither party, obviously they're going to do everything possible, to make sure that doesn't happen. And so we got to find some way to square that
And it's
circle
not
where
just the parties, it's
because
the
clearly
special
the
interest
people have
groups
an
too.
appetite.
Yeah.
For something different. Oh yeah,
I
well,
mean, like, if you
and the
look at, like,
parties
AIPAC or any
in
of
a
these
lot
other
of ways
special
are
interest
just,
groups.
and yeah, and again, if we could get it back to where you could get other people in, and we could maybe deal with the problem of the money in politics. But that's just one of those issues that we'll never be able to tackle legislatively until we get different people in there, because of course the people that benefit from the bad system are the ones who make the rules.
Yeah, and there's a lot of them, and there's way,
Pros the
way, way,
opposite of
way more of
Congress.
them.
Pros the opposite of con. What's the opposite of progress? Congress.
Yeah.
It's an old joke, but unfortunately, it's one that keeps telling itself. The
Yeah.
presidency has been bad and bad behavior, and there's been some bad behavior on the Supreme Court. But it's because it's Congress's job to keep the other two branches in, and there's been no good behavior in Congress in 70 years. So, I mean, Congress hasn't done its
Yeah.
fundamental job, which is to reapportion the House based upon population, since the 1920 census. We have literally now gone 100
Jeez.
years. We are 3 times the size of a country as we were then. with the exact same size of the House of Representatives. Like, if you would go back to Madison's scheme, the House would have 7,000 members if the districts were as small as they were at the founding. Like,
Wow.
that might be unworkable, but I tell you, like, if I could actually change it, like, I mean, it's, you know, they was supposed to grow, and Congress every 10 years reapportioned the House for all of American history until 1920. And then they didn't do it once, and they haven't done it since. And because of that, you know, we just have, you know, the fact that we have whole states. You know, Wyoming is the size, you know, is half the size of a small congressional district anywhere else. And the more that
Right.
gets out of whack, as far as the electoral college just being so radically different than the population. And again, it's notable, we've only had 4 elections where the electoral college and the popular vote went different ways, and 2 of them have been in the last generation. You know, and you know,
Yeah.
it took 200 years of American history to get to the first 2. So, you know, we need to fix some of those things structurally, but there's no way to fix it, because again, it requires Congress to do its job, and Congress is not going to do its job because none of the incentives are in place to encourage politicians to do that job. And so, you know, if we could get
Yeah.
money out of politics and have term limits and all sorts of things, but like, getting to that requires us actually fixing the country first, and that's why it's a daunting chicken and the egg problem.
Man. Well, yeah, the money in politics is king for sure. With the interest there, and then before we could even do anything with the parties, we have to do something with that, and it's a total disaster, like you said. But I like your idea. Shit, we're 2.5 hours into this thing, boys, and we haven't been blown up with nuclear weapons yet, so that's good. Maybe
Good
something
Bob
else has
Long
happened
Kong.
while we've been stuck in these studios that we don't know about. But
Yeah, we'll
all
have
right,
to check.
man.
So, well, thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate you sharing your platform here and having these conversations.
Yeah, absolutely, Sean, and thanks for coming on, dude.
Absolutely.
It was nice
We'll
having
have
an
to do it
adult in
again
the room
sometime.
as well. So,
Right.
We'll keep up the good work.
All right, man. Love you guys. We'll talk soon.
all right, have a good evening, guys.